It's day 2 of the African Monetary and Economic Sovereignty Conference in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. The conference, which continues under the theme Leveraging Multipolarity, Economic Options for Africa, aims to see the emergence of an Africa that makes its own decisions on its own terms. So from Addis Ababa, New Central Business Correspondent Perpetua Fasanmi-Peter joins me for more on this. Perpetua, it's a pleasant morning, I must say to you. Nice to have you around. How is the weather treating you in Addis Ababa?
Wearing, clothes with long sleeves, and that, of course, is because Addis Ababa is a very cold place.
All right, so I'd like to get more updates from you now.
All right, if you're asking me about the conference, yes, this is the second day, and I think I should also mention that during the first day, which was yesterday, what we saw was an agenda setting and sort of a foundation laying for the conversations that will then ensue up until the day after, up until tomorrow. And so for yesterday, what we did was to establish the fact that we have, it all started with the bipolar world, and then we had the unipolar world, and then we have some other countries springing up and become economic powers, and they were able to make decisions and hold some power. And that talks about whether you want to talk about Brazil, you want to talk about Russia, you want to talk about China or even India. And so with the emergence of these top economies, we saw that they were also able to control and to own their own. And then the conversation comes to the fact that this multipolarity, where we have economies that are springing up and being able to take charge and all of that. And so for that yesterday was that for Africa to be able to do that, Africa would need to deal with some of the issues it currently faces, whether it's poverty or whether it's illicit financial flows or whatever that challenge is. Africa would have to fix all of this, grow its economy so that it can then be able to wield its own power and determine its own terms. And there were conversations around the need for some form of coordination in Africa. The fact that maybe we need to begin to see things like a debtors cartel. We need to see things like commodities cartel, because when you talk about commodities, when you talk about minerals, Africa has a lot of them, especially when you're even looking at the green transition and all of that. So those were the conversations we had yesterday. And just like I said, that was the agenda setting conversation, or the agenda setting conference day. And then for today, we're taking the conversation a notch higher. We're starting with climate change. And you might want to ask, if you're talking about, leveraging multipolarity and economic options for Africa, what is climate change doing here? Well, that's one of the conversations for today. And later on today, does that fit into the whole conversation about Africa, taking advantage of multipolarity and also considering economic options that can work for it?
Thanks so much. Climate change is already devastating lives and livelihoods. It's putting Africa deeper into debt. We are seeing that Africa is borrowing to build bridges, to build roads that are then being destroyed by floods that are actually induced by the ever-growing climate crisis. And so it is important that as we develop, we cannot divorce our development from our approaches to climate change. So how do we develop in a way that avoids emissions, in a way that ensures that we are protecting the environment in a way that is not putting us into debt? We're seeing this week, actually, most of our ministers of environment are in Baku, Azerbaijan, to discuss the new collective quantified goal that will replace the 100 billion figure that was pledged in 2009 and has never been delivered. And Africa has called for $1.3 trillion based on the devastating impacts, based on the needs that it has, so that it's able to adapt to the ever-changing climate, so that resilience, and that we're able to actually compensate those who are losing their lives, those who are losing their livelihoods. So we must ensure that this year, as we agree on a new collective quantified goal, that this goal is ambitious enough, that actually reflects the decision that was made in Dubai last year, when all governments gathered and agreed to transition away from fossil fuels, agreed to triple investments in renewables, and agreed to double energy efficiency. So we need to see the finance flow from developed countries to developing countries, so that we are able to implement our development plans in a way that does not destroy the environment.
When you talked about how that we need to get this financing from the developed world, I ask myself, aren't we talking about, maybe some form of independence? Aren't we talking about Africa owning its own and, being a power on its own. So if we want to achieve that, do we still need to go, I wouldn't call it begging, or to expect, some funds to flow from developed countries? I know you might want to say that Africa contributes the least, and these are the countries that are responsible for what we are seeing in the environment. But how do we sort of, balance these conversations?
Africa is already paying for climate change. We are paying that through, the livelihoods that we're losing, the roads that are being destroyed, the emergency responses that we have to do whenever climate-induced disasters happen. And I'll take you back to the Paris Agreement, because climate change is the result of how developed countries develop, the part they took to develop. They banned fossil fuels, and therefore they have a historical responsibility to provide this finance to enable African and the global South to adapt. Adaptation is key for us, and after adaptation, to enable us to be able to transition to whatever renewable energy that we have in abundance also. You'll see the statistics, for example, out of the investments that go into renewable energy, Africa attracts only 2% of that. Out of the global investments, only 2% comes to Africa. That is the injustice we are calling for. We're not just talking about transition, we are also talking about access. About 600 million Africans have no access to energy. About 900 million Africans have no access to clean cooking. So how do we deal with that? And therefore, and Africa is the region that will actually enable the world to transition to the renewables energy that we're talking about, because we are home to the critical minerals. Instead of just exporting those critical minerals, that's how we're going to create our own economic sovereignty and be able to also address future climate impacts. But we need the finance. And when you look at the conversations yesterday, when you look at the cost of borrowing for Africa, it's way higher than the cost of borrowing to developed countries. When we look at the whole issue around how the global financial architecture is structured, the whole issue around the trade architecture, the whole issue around the investments architecture, we need to deal with these things, because we are operating within a system that was created when none of us existed. We are operating within a system that was created in 1944. It was created in 1944 to serve the needs who were present at that time. That system does not work for us. We need transformation of those systems. I'll give you an example. The IMF, which now controls most of our fiscal policies or determines where our governments invest today, the IMF is a system that is based on $1, one vote. The IMF, when we had COVID, it gave $650 billion worth of special drawing rights for governments to respond to help governments respond to the COVID crisis. But because of that unequal system, because of this quota system within the IMF, Africa as a whole continent, out of the $650 billion, Africa as a whole got $33 billion only. The US, which did not need these resources because it has the capacity, it had the capability to respond to the COVID crisis, the US got $117 billion. This is a system in which we are operating in. It's not based on needs. It's based on people's power, and that's what we need to transform.
Absolutely. So how can Africa actually get there?
No individual country can do it alone, because if you decide to come up with an industrial policy and implement it, you will be punished. I'll give you an example of, we've seen the dynamics with the Dangote refinery, the national politics aside. Dangote has had to buy local crude oil and pay in dollars. Why is that happening? We saw the credit rating agencies downgrading him. That's the same thing that happens to our governments.
Let me just put this there. We have a system in place now, which of course was supposed to begin on the 1st of October, where all of this happens in Naira now.
That's great, and that's good news, because because of the need to accumulate dollars. That's what puts us in problems. We have to accumulate dollars to import the energy we need to use, to import the food that we need to use, to import the pharmaceuticals that we need to use. And that weakens our own national currencies. So that's the system that we need to change. Invest in local production, local manufacturing, so that we don't have to be importing gasoline again. We can buy it in Nairas. We don't have to be importing food. I'll tell you that the food import for wheat and rice alone for Africa is about $110 billion a year. And we are paying it in dollars. We have to acquire in dollars. So if you are able to increase manufacturing, increase production, so that we are not required to import, and invest in our own food sovereignty, invest in our agriculture. We have the most arable land in the world. We can make use of that and have targeted interventions that target our rural farmers. We can achieve this if our Africans come together, do this together, and have a Pan-African industrialization vision that provides complementarity for each of the countries. We're not competing against each other, but we are complementing each other's capabilities.
You know, when you say that, it sounds very fantastic, because even yesterday, a lot of the conversation centered around coordination and all of that. And my question really, every time this comes up, is we've always had some form of coordination, whether it's the G77, whatever it is really, or even the ECOWAS, or even AFTA, or even that conversation around, single currency. But at the end of the day, it's really not delivering what it's supposed to deliver. And I also remember yesterday, someone was saying that maybe because we do not have the political will, or individual countries are, interested in probably developing. For you, what is the way forward looking at all of those things? Because coordination is something we have been trying and it hasn't seemed to work. What's going to make it work now?
These things are not that technical. It's political. And we're dealing with we're operating in a system that is influenced externally. If Africans decide we're not going to be influenced by external forces, we are going to do this ourselves. We are going to finance our operations. Look,
what happens to the loans? We get the loans from them. You also talked about some of the food we have to import, and we need dollars to do all of these things. So that dependency is the challenge right here now. So how do we do away with it without hurting ourselves? Is that possible?
I think one thing, we should maybe stop or reduce growing flowers to export to get the dollars to import what we need to eat. We grow what we don't eat and import what. And that requires political leadership and continuity of policies. So we need to have a long-term vision, not the 5-year cycles that we do have that are linked to our own elections. We need to rethink our development visions. Let's have the long-term plan. We have Agenda 2063. How many of our leaders refer to Agenda 2063? Every leader that speaks in global forums only speaks about Agenda 2030, which is the UN's Agenda 2030 agenda. We need to own that and socialize that within our own citizens. Let it not just be a political leadership agenda, but it has to be an African-owned agenda. The AU itself says it's a people's-driven. We need to see that in the actual sense. And our politicians need to listen to the technocrats. They need to listen to the ideas that are coming from such conferences.
Well, that brings me to my final question. So beyond this conversation, how do we get these conversations, to sort of drive change, to drive some...
Bringing it down to our own national jurisdictions and continuing these conversations and trying to understand how the world operates. Africa has an opportunity in the current geopolitical space. We don't need to be aligned to anyone. I think this is the moment that we need to revive the non-aligned movement and play that role where we are friends of everyone and enemies of no one. We have to play that game. That force that was there in the 1970s, in the 60s, the non-aligned movement need to come back. This is the moment. And this is the moment to push for a new international economic order that was envisioned in the 70s.
Absolutely. 50 years down the line, we'll still be watching. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Perpetua, for having me.
All right, well, there you have it. You've heard him talk about, a lot of things, really. It's climate change this morning and afternoon, but later in the afternoon, the conversation will switch to debt restructuring, and that, of course, is something I'll be keeping a tab on, and, of course, I'll bring that.
A lot of discussions have gone on at the AMIS conference in Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. And, while our guest was talking, one thing that actually crossed my mind is the fact that I feel being bitten by the fact that Africa contributes a lot to powering the global economy. But then when it comes to the socio-economic challenges that the continent is facing, a whole lot needs to be done. But then we see the global community, the same global community, turning a blind eye. And there is a need for concerted efforts, deliberate efforts when it comes to helping Africa deal with its challenges. But then we've seen G summits come and go, and we've seen the world powers come pledging and saying they will be able to put funds together so that Africa can, most especially, deal with the issue around climate change. But when it comes to redeeming these pledges, these funds that are needed by this continent, it's really been abysmal. And, I'm just wondering, probably there could be some sort of convergence point between the global south and the global north to actually rally round and find drastic and meaningful solutions to the perennial challenges confronting the continent. Well, one can only hope that something might be done beside talks, but then actions coming into play right now so that Africa can continue to do what it needs to do in terms of its, fantastic contributions to ensuring that the global economy continues to thrive.